All right, let's get started on this American Revolution War. All right, so for objectives, what I want you to be able to do is to identify the importance of the key Revolutionary War battles. We're going to talk about really three big ones that we're going to talk about. The first one, the turning point, and at the end, the surrender. And there are a lot more out there. You can study them on your own. I want you to talk about and explain the key British tax policies that angered the colonists who thought was a violation of their rights. I want you to outline colonist resistance to the British rule leading up to the war. I want you to explain the difference in the three main groups of colonists: the loyalists, the patriots, and the neutrals. And then I want you to be able to describe the advantages and disadvantages of the British and American colonists. Militaries, because if you look, they're kind of not equal when they start the war. So let's go ahead and get through this. So to start off, King George III, you'll see him there. He was the king at the time of all this of the American Revolution, and even through the he took over in about 1760. But he was victorious in the French and Indian War, which we talked about last, and he took over all those territories from France and got some from Spain, Florida, remember. He's the one who did the proclamation of 1763 that prohibited settlement west. He instituted a lot of tax policies we talked about in the French-Indian War. And he said they were there to pay for the war effort, and the military was there to protect the colonists. The colonists thought, hey, no, we're paying a whole lot of money, and we're not getting a lot from it, and you're restricting us. You're not letting us be free people. So what about these tax policies that really angered the colonists? Well, the first one was the Sugar Act. We mentioned that back in the French and Indian War, but it was a tax on sugar, molasses, indigo, which is a color, coffee, wine, and all the ship owners, all their cargo had to be inspected. Well, they didn't like that because they were also doing a lot of smuggling back then too. So that got canceled. Then they had the Stamp Act of 65. That was a tax on all paper, printed materials, and legal documents such as marriage licenses, birth certificates, death certificates. And then you had the Tea Act. That allowed the British East India Company to trade tea with all the colonies tax-free. But they had a monopoly. The colonists wanted to be able to be free to buy whatever tea they wanted from wherever they wanted. And a strange thing is, this tea that came from the East India Company actually had a lower cost in the colonies. But the colonists felt like they were bribed to do it. They didn't like that that their free choice was taken away from them and they couldn't buy whatever tea they wanted. And these are a couple of acts that the colonists thought were a violation of their rights. King George passed the Quartering Act, which meant, remember, they're sending all these new military folks over here to keep the proclamation of 1763 enforced. And this act basically said that when the military barracks and any other public housing was full, the act then required the colonists to feed and house British soldiers in their homes if needed. Now just think about if the U.S. Army had to be stationed in your home, if you would like that. There were declaratory acts, which basically meant that because with these other acts and policies, the colonists started making up their own laws. And they had been for 120 years. They'd been making up their own laws. But the Parliament in England basically said, "Whoa, stop that! Stop right there. We're going to declare that all colonist laws have to be approved by Parliament back in England." And you can imagine that the colonists did not take that very kindly. They'd been basically running themselves for 120 years. And they were like, hey, no, we don't like that. And finally, you had the Townshend Act, which again comes back. It taxes tea, glass, paper, silk. And it officially allowed British customs agents to search ships legally. And again, the colonists are doing a lot of smuggling. A lot of things are coming on the triangle trade that are not being looked at. Remember we talked to mercantilism about the salutary negligence, how the British were kind of letting things go for a while. Well, King George was not about that, and he was very upset, and they were still trying to pay for this huge war debt. So there were three kind of groups of colonists. About a third were the patriots. They wanted independence from Britain. They wanted just to tell Britain, bye Felicia, and be done with it. They provided troops to the army that was led by George Washington, and they were inspired by Locke and Paine and Patrick Henry, and we'll talk more about who they were. We've talked about Locke and Paine in the Enlightenment block, which was just before this, and Patrick Henry is a new guy. He's a new firebrand. He's a new speaker that everybody likes to listen to. Then you had the Loyalist. They're also a nickname is called the Tories. About a third of the Americans living in the colonies were loyal to Britain for economic or political connections. They either had family that was there, they had a business that was linked to Britain, so they didn't want to lose money, and they felt that the taxes that were being paid were justified by the king. They didn't have a problem with him. And then there were the neutrals. There's no picture of them because they were trying to stay out of the picture. They didn't want to take sides. They wanted to remain neutral. They wanted to stay uninvolved as long as they could. And roughly about a third of the country was divided within each one of those. So who were some of these patriots? Well, one group was called the Sons of Liberty. It was a group of patriots. We just talked about them. And they were a secret society that was designed to resist the Stamp Act. They did a whole lot of things. They got colonies to basically make up their own documents that didn't have to be approved with the official British stamp. There's some other things you can look up on the internet for that, for videos. They conducted all their business without stamps. They didn't have a problem with it. And they would organize boycotts. A boycott is when you don't buy something. So they would organize boycotts of tea and tell everybody don't buy tea, and then the citizens would not buy tea. They were mostly in Boston, and women were very involved too. They were very involved in not drinking tea. They promised not to buy British cloth, and they made spinning clubs to make their own cloth so people could buy it from them. A big event happened in 1770. Excuse me. A big event happened in 1770. A group of Bostonians, which is what you call somebody from Boston, they were harassing or messing with or poking fun of British redcoats or British military in Boston. And then something happened. Nobody knows what's for sure. Both sides of the story are out there, but there was no Twitter, there was no cell phone coverage of any of this. But somehow the British ended up firing into the crowd. 5 people were killed and more were wounded. Well, people were now very upset because this is that military they're bringing over to protect, and they just killed 5 people. Because of that, committees of correspondence were set up in 1772. You see Sam Adams there in the picture. There were local committees set up by Sam Adams, and they were intended to exchange information from colony to colony about British policy and form effective opposition. So they had spies out looking what were the British doing, what could you find out about the British strategies, how could they effectively oppose, what policies could they do, what boycotts could they do, how could they make life difficult for the British military and the governors. If you remember back to the Albany Conference, which was the first conference during the French and Indian War where the colonists got together, remember 7 out of 13? It was formed by Ben Franklin. These committees of correspondence are sort of akin to that. They're now, all the colonies are talking to each other about how to work together. And that Albany Conference earlier was the first one. Then you had the tea tax. We just talked about that. The tea tax happened. And the Sons of Liberty, they got all mad one night in December the 16th. They got very mad. There were some ships loaded with East India Trading Company tea. It was in Boston Harbor. That had not been unloaded. Nobody would unload it. So the Sons of Liberty got real mad. And they just rowed. You can see some of the pictures there behind this. They rowed their boats out to the ships. They boarded them. Some people say they were dressed as Native Americans. Some people say they were just colonialists. But they went out and dumped all this tea in the Boston Harbor to protest the monopoly of the East India Company and the impact on the American smuggling business. Because a lot of people were making a lot of money smuggling tea, smuggling coffee, smuggling sugar, molasses, a lot of other things around the colonies. And that was kind of a big thing that happened. It's a big protest, and nobody got hurt, but a lot of money, as amount of $1 million worth of tea was dumped in the harbor. And guess who was very, very angry at this? One King George in Parliament. So what did he do? Well, Parliament and the King came up with the Coercive Acts. That's what they called them, to try and get the colonists back in order. So they're trying to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. The American colonists called them the Intolerable Acts because they couldn't tolerate and couldn't accept these acts from Parliament. But these were an attempt to punish the colonies, and there were four of them. I think I've only got four here. One was the Quebec Act that dealt with something up in Canada, not really relevant to us. But the first one, they closed down the port of Boston. They just told Boston, fine, you're going to act like children, we're going to treat you like children, we're going to close down your port, and we'll see how much money you can make now and how much you suffer. The other thing they did was British officials would go back to Britain for trial. So if they were a British person, not a colonist, say a British governor, British military, they went back to Britain. Well, do you think the people in the colonies were happy about that, considering the crime might have happened in the colonies? They took away the Massachusetts Charter and restricted town meetings in Massachusetts because they were getting very upset at Massachusetts. And then they had additions to the Quartering Act of 1765. And remember, that's the one that said that, if all the public housing is full, then people must support the military in their homes. And this just made more additions to that. So you can look at the colonists and you can tell they're not very happy at any of this. They're very upset. So then all the colonies agree to meet again. They call what's called the First Continental Congress, and they meet in Philadelphia. 12 of the 13 colonies meet, and they draft up a Declaration of Colonial Rights. Here's what we think we should be able, our rights are in the colonies as English citizens. 56 delegates met. They're also talking about defense. But they really want to run their own affairs like they had been doing for 140 years here. 150 by this point, in 1774. And it was the first meeting of the colonies in the independence movement, the first big meeting of all the colonies. The committees of correspondence would just write to each other. They didn't really meet, but they were working together. But now you've got a bunch of delegates in Philadelphia seeing every day as representative of their colony. And then in March of 75, Patrick Henry, who's a delegate in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he gets up, and he's one of the ones we're talking about that kind of inspired a lot of the Loyalists. He gets up and says, "It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen, may I cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand here idle? Why stand we here idle? It means, why are we here doing nothing? Why is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" In other words, why aren't they doing something? Are they worried they might be held accountable and go to jail if this doesn't happen? With hands held high as if in bondage, he acted as if to throw off the shackles that held him captive. This is him now. These are his actions. He says those things. Then he throws his hands up, hands together like he's in bondage, and he says, "Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Basically, he was saying, if I can't live as a free man, then I will die fighting for it. And those words got published. Remember the printing press? And they got spun around. A lot of people took that to heart, and that kind of became a battle cry for a lot of the patriots throughout the Revolution. So one night in 1775, this young man named Paul Revere, these committees of correspondence were watching British troops, and the patriots had been stocking weapons and cannon and powder and ammunition out in a little town called Concord. And the British heard about it and said, "We're going to go out and get it." So Paul Revere was notified, and 2 other gentlemen, Patrick Dawes and 1 other. You can see a church in the background. They put 2 lights in there. The signal was 1 by land, 2 by sea. So they put the lanterns up there, and then Paul Revere took off on his ride, warning the Minutemen. And you can see them being woken up in the middle of the night. You can see them with their guns now. He's riding out saying, you know, the Redcoats are coming, the Redcoats are coming, warning the Minutemen, who then get their weapon and start marching to where they're supposed to be going, waiting on the next signal what to happen. Well, so all the Minutemen show up here in the town of Lexington, and they had 2 brief skirmishes on this day in April 19th. We call it Patriots Day up in Boston. The British, again, were trying to capture ammunition and Patriot leaders who were outside of Boston, and Minutemen fought for the Patriots. So the British are out marching to Concord. This is the town of Lexington, or Lexington Green. They meet the Patriots. The British, they're not sure who fired first. Again, but there were no cell phone cameras or news coverage of this. But a couple of Patriots are killed. A couple of British are killed. The Patriots scatter and leave. And the British start marching forward to Concord till they get to this bridge. This is the Old North Bridge outside of Concord. It's the only bridge to cross this little river here. It's very deep. So the British start marching across this, and the Patriots come across the other end. And then they fire the British, or excuse me, the militia. There are a lot of them. They fire their cannons into the British. The British break and run back down this road. It's about 12 miles. And they start marching back and running back to Boston for safety. But all along the road, the Minutemen had gathered along the road and started fighting a guerrilla war and just firing from the woods at the British and killing British soldiers or wounding them with their weapons. And this was what was called the shot heard round the world, where the whole world took notice of these citizens, average citizens, farmers, merchants, tea makers, blacksmiths, some slaves fired, and some free blacks fired weapons at the British to protest and to fight for their own freedom. So that happened. The British were not happy. A lot of things are happening now with the Patriots. There's a big hill in Boston. This happened a few months later in 1775 after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The Colonials are up on top. The British are at the bottom, so the British have to come up. They started running low on ammunition. On top, the Patriots did. So the British attacked them 3 times. 450 450 Colonials die at the top of this. The British eventually win and capture it, but they had 1,000 British casualties. Well, who's got the confidence now? The colonists have the confidence. They know they can fight and win, and that the British are going to suffer a lot. Yeah, they may fight and lose, but they've got confidence they can win if more people join them. The British, it was a British victory, but it was very hollow because they lost a lot of people that day. So now the Second Continental Congress meets in July. 2 battles have taken place, both Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, and they offer what's called the Olive Branch Petition. They write a letter to the king basically saying, we want to be loyal to Britain, we want to end all this, we want to stay European, we want to stay English, so please accept our petition, please accept what we want. How can we negotiate to get what we want? To get rid of some of these acts, how can we negotiate? Ben Franklin takes it over to him. He reads it, throws it out. He declares them in rebellion. That means they're actually in rebellion against the king. It means they're committing treason. So the Second Continental Congress says, fine. They held the second one. The Continental Congress, George Washington, remember him from the French Indian War, he is appointed commander of the Continental Army and sent off to Boston to fight the British. All 13 colonies are now here. And the delegates declare independence when they feel there's no way to work with Britain. Once they see that England's not going to change their mind, they say, okay, well, let's just go for it. Go big or stay home. So they declare independence. So at the Second Continental Congress, on 7 June 1776, a man named Richard Henry Lee from Virginia stands up and he says, resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So that was the first time somebody said we need to be independent and break off our allegiance to the British Crown. So they think about it, they table it, they study it, they set up a committee of 5 to draft a resolution based on that motion that Richard Henry Lee posted. And you can see the ones that are there who were on it. And Thomas Jefferson was the youngest, a young lawyer from Virginia. And look at the states. There's Massachusetts, a southern colony, middle colonies, northern colonies. They're all there. Roger Sherman. They're all very smart people here. Very smart. So Thomas Jefferson writes the first draft. It incorporates the ideas of Locke and Paine. We'll talk about those in a minute. But those ideas we talked about back in the Enlightenment. It laid the foundation for our system of government that ultimately unified the American people. Lee's resolution for independence was approved on 2 July 1776. So we actually became an independent country on 2 July 1776. But the Declaration of Independence that was drafted and written, that was the actual document they signed, wasn't approved until 4 July on a 56-0 vote. And the actual independence document, the actual Declaration of Independence that you see on display in D.C., that was actually written by Mr. Matlock on the parchment paper, was signed on 2 August 1776. Now realize, it was an act of treason if the colonists had lost. All those people who signed it would have been put to death had they not won the war. So in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson talked about the abuses that the king did. He talked about self-evident truths. I mean, it's obvious that these rights that we have, things are self-evident. You don't have to be given them. He talked about equality. All men are created equal. And of course, there's great debate on what does all men mean. We come to find out or believe today that it's all humans. Talked about the natural rights from God, the consent of the governed from John Locke, the right to overthrow a government if you don't like it, social contract and ordered liberty from John Locke. You remember those? So all of those are in the Declaration of Independence. So now you got these two armies out there battling. Well, who are they? Well, you got the British Army that's got they've got very professional soldiers. They've got mercenaries. They've hired soldiers from other countries. They've got more men and supplies, and they've got a very powerful navy. The colonies, they got great leadership. They got some wonderful leaders out there in the field, but no real military experience except for Washington. They're on the defensive. They've got a home field game. They know the land. They know the country. They know everything about it, and they've got a lot of support. They eventually get French and Spanish support, but not until much later in the war. And that patriotism and spirit, they're in it because they want to be there and they're fighting for an ideal. The British soldiers that are over here are in a foreign land. They don't want to be here. It's not home. They don't really care about keeping the colonies or not. And they have very decentralized military orders, meaning that General Washington gave his commanders the ability to do what they wanted to do as long as they met his objectives. So the British, let's look at their weaknesses. They had very poor leadership. They didn't send their best people over here because they thought they could beat a bunch of farmers and merchants. They were fighting on enemy territory. I mentioned that a minute ago. Most of the British soldiers don't care to be here, don't want to die here. They had very long supply lines. They had to go back to England to get things. Lacked a lot of public support. Again, remember, only about a third of the people here in the colonies supported them. And it took months to get orders. So here's what we want to do. Had to go back to Parliament in England or the British High Command back there to get approved and come back here. Whereas General Washington's guys are just making things up as they go. The colonies, they had fewer men to fight. They had food and supply shortages, even though they were playing at home. A lot of things were happening during the winter. They had to keep people fed. They had a very untrained army. Remember, they were farmers, merchants, not exactly your war types. And they had a very small very small navy to go with the most powerful navy in the world. So what were their strategies? Well, the Americans just had a war of attrition. They just wanted to wear down the British and keep fighting until they got tired. They were using guerrilla tactics. You don't have to win a battle. You just got to keep wounding the British enough. You fight from the trees. You fight lying down. You don't fight the British stand up in an open battle. And they want to try and make an alliance with one of Britain's enemies. They're not sure who. They'll take anybody, but they want to do anything they can to get another country in to help them out. The British want to break the colonies half, cut the north off from the south. That makes perfect sense. They want to blockade the ports to prevent a flow of goods and supplies from an ally or the other colonies. So they put all their ships out in front of the ports. And then they want to divide and conquer. They want to use the loyalists who are there among the people to help them either convert other people, convert neutrals, or to use them for a colonial loyalist army. So Washington soldiers, again, untrained. They were from the lower classes. Rich people didn't do it unless they were an officer. They were peasants, landless. They're just workers. They were underpaid, underfed, and had occasional mutinies where they just said, "I'm out of here. I quit." The British soldiers were called the Redcoats. In this case, it was a colonial. They had hunger and disease and infection over here, a lot of amputations, had very harsh discipline. They were in a bad country, but their officers did not treat them well, and their sergeants didn't treat them well. And then they had German mercenaries, the Hessians, which are a region of Germany, who were very, very tough fighters. So Washington's strategy was basically, hey, I got a small army. I got to keep them in the field. I don't want to fight a decisive battle. I don't want to go, face to face, toe to toe with these guys. I want to avoid any situation that might get my army destroyed. So he backs up a lot. He'll do a small engagement and retreat. Small engagement and retreat. He lets the British capture several cities. He's just trying to be an annoyance and cause as much damage as he can without losing people. But his biggest contribution was his leadership. When everything seemed bad, he was always there. He was at Valley Forge with his officers and his soldiers. He was sick. He was cold. Whatever his soldiers were living through, he was living through it too. And they knew that if he could do it, then they could do it. So here's kind of the campaign. Up in the north, you had several battles here. Here are Lexington and Concord outside of Boston. There's Bunker Hill. But these are some of the routes and battles from the north. Don't get too excited about that. Again, the only ones I want you to know right now are Lexington and Concord. Those were the first ones. The middle part, again, I mentioned Washington. He lost at New York. He lost at Monmouth. He lost at Philadelphia. He lost at Germantown. He lost at Brandywine Creek. All these different ones, he's losing, but he's making it painful on the British, but he's not losing his army. They leave New York City. The British burn a lot of it down, so that's not a good thing for the Americans. The American public is really getting upset at this because Washington keeps losing cities. And then one night, on the 25th of December, so Christmas Eve, when all the Germans and the Hessians and the British are just, they had their Christmas parties. Nobody attacks in the winter because it's cold. There's snowing outside. Washington's got a problem because a lot of his soldiers will stop being in the army on 1 January. He needs a win. So he decides to do a surprise counterattack on Christmas Eve, on the night of Christmas. He crosses the Delaware. You see this big picture here. You see him pushing ice out of the way. And they march 10 miles down, and they attack all the British and the Hessians while they're asleep. Really, not a shot was fired. It was a great strategic victory. He didn't lose anybody. They rented all these boats to cross over, captured a bunch of prisoners, captured a bunch of supplies, and a lot of people stayed in the army after that because now they know they can win. They've got a great leader. They know they can do a lot of great things. And then the Battle of Saratoga happens. General Gates is up there. and he's up in New York. They have this. The British are trying to cut off the colonies from the supply lines, and then the colonists win. They go up there and beat the British and beat them badly. And then Benjamin Franklin, who is in France as an ambassador, convinces the French that the colonials have a chance to win. And the French are still very, very angry at the French-Indian War. They want to get back at Britain, and this is their chance. So they become open allies. Now they know there's a chance. They give troops, and they give supplies, and they give their navy to go and help the Americans in the colonies. So they give their assistance in 1778. Now the British are at war in France. They have to move some of their equipment over there, and they can't send as much over to the American trade. The French start trading with the Americans. The Spanish assist later in 79. So now they've got two navies against the British. So because they're both very upset from the French and Indian War, they're trying to get back at them. They don't really care about the colonies, because they think maybe if the colonies win, they can come over and attack the colonies. But they can definitely get back something from the Americans, because they want to definitely beat the British. So in the southern part, Charleston, the British start marching up through here. They lose the Battle of Kings Mountain. They lose the Battle of Cowpens, come out to Wilmington, go up to Charlottesville, and then come back to Yorktown, and that's where Cornwallis is finally going to meet his match and surrender in 1781. But Britain in the South, they thought that people were more loyal in the South. Southern resources were more valuable. There was a lot of farming, a lot of tobacco, a lot of rice. So they wanted to preserve those. And the British start winning a number of small victories, but they can't pacify, which means make happy, the people in the countryside. And then we found that same thing in Vietnam. We're finding it in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria right now. It's hard to make people in the countryside loyal to one side or another. There's General Nathaniel Greene, who was leading of the army down there in the South. Well, so 1781 comes around. Cornwallis is going to Yorktown to hopefully have a British squadron of Navy come in and pick them up. Count de Rochambeau and Washington march from around D.C. down here and make Cornwallis surrender. Admiral de Grasse is with the French Navy. They surround, they pummel the British with artillery and attacks, and the British Army surrenders down here, on October the 19th. And that effectively ends the war. The British are defeated militarily. So you can see they had a large force on the British General Cornwallis. They're trapped on a peninsula. They're backed up against the water. They need the British Navy, but the French Navy is blocking the river. The British Navy can't resupply them, or they can't escape. So it's the last major battle of the war. And this was it. So you can see this is the York River. This is where they're trying to get to. The French Navy is out here. All this blue, these are French. These are the Maryland forces. This is Virginia forces, Pennsylvania, the Rhode Island, New Jersey, Virginia militia. All of these are firing cannons from the French and the British, French and the Americans over here into the city of Yorktown and where the encampment was. So Cornwallis finally surrenders. This is Cornwallis back here. Actually, he didn't even come out. He claimed sickness. He didn't want to be the one to do this. This is General Washington, and this is the French General Rochambeau accepting the surrender of the British. And this turned the world upside down, because how could a bunch of peasants, farmers, merchants, and a bunch of untrained people defeat the largest, most powerful, trained army in the world? And a lot of other revolutions started after that, because we gave people hope and the idea that it can happen. The world just goes around and around. So the Treaty of Paris in 1783, it ends the Revolutionary War. It sets up borders on the United States to the Mississippi River. Britain finally accepts the United States as an independent nation. And Congress agrees that American loyalists will have property restored. So those who are loyal to the British government can keep their property. But the Americans make life miserable for a lot of those who are loyal, and they leave and then their property's taken. So here was the United States in 1787. All of these states are out there now, and we now officially have all of this. It's open for settlement because remember that proclamation line said they couldn't go, and now it's open. And here's the impact of the war. The ideas of liberty, what we can do and what we can't do, spreads throughout Europe and the world. It leads to revolutions ever since, because if we can do it, a lot of people can. And this is a radical concept. It means it was crazy that the world accepted the idea of human inequity. How can we do it and others can't? And in the U.S., only white males truly gain freedom. But the seeds are planted later for women and slaves, and the Indians just totally lose out. They're pushed out farther west because now we can go out west to the Mississippi, so we start taking Indians and pushing them farther and farther west. And here's a timeline I provided. I give my class a hard copy, but all the British actions are over here in red, in order, starting with 1763 as the Proclamation of 1763, and up through the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So it's about a 20-year period that we just looked at of different actions, the colonial actions, and then the actions of the British that got us to our independence officially in 1783. So in summary, it all started because the colonials felt used and abused by England. They felt mistreated, they felt unloved, they felt violated. They thought their rights were violated. We have certain rights here as colonists, certain things we should have, and the king's not protecting us. Paine and John Locke, their thoughts fueled the fires of liberty. It helped write the Declaration of Independence, those ideas. It really kept people, and especially Thomas Paine with his book Common Sense. It was published. It was the most published book in the world for a long time. Major battles that were important, Saratoga and Yorktown, specifically those two, with Saratoga being the turning point. They got French and Spanish involvement, and Yorktown is basically the last major battle. The Declaration of Independence came out of this, that declared our independence, said we'd be free, and kind of laid the groundwork for our future government. And then the Treaty of 1783 ended the war and ensured the independence of the United States. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you got something out of it. Hope it's useful. And thank you for listening. We'll see you in class.